Monday, March 18th, the Budget and Finance Committee will begin with resolutions. If committee members can go ahead and take your seats. Thank you. Councilman Hall, Vice Chair Roden. We're going to begin with resolutions. RS 2019-1631, sponsor Virture, authorizes the Department of Law to compromise and settle the personal injury claim of USAA General Indemnity Company and subrogate of Richard Nelson against Metro government in the amount of $10,000. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Seeing no discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Resolution is recommended. RS 2019-1632, sponsor Virture, approves a grant from the Tennessee Highland Rim Healthcare Coalition to the Nashville Fire Department for the purchase of materials and build-out of a utility trailer. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Seeing no discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Resolution is recommended. RS 2019-1633, sponsors Virture Gilmore, approves an amendment to the grant contract authorized by Resolution RS 2018-1330 from the Office of Family Safety to Agape Incorporated, formerly known as Morning Star Sanctuary. Is there a motion? Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Seeing no discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Resolution is recommended. RS 2019-1634, sponsors Virture Syracuse Pridemore, approves a grant from Tumble Track and American Gymnasts for equipment and Flip Fest Gymnastics Camp and USAG Tennessee Gymnastics to establish a gymnastics program at the Madison Recreation Center. There is a letter to approve. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Seeing no discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Resolution is recommended. RS 2019-1635, sponsors Virture, Gilmore, and Pulley, approves a grant from the Tennessee Department of Health to the Metro Board of Health to provide HIV, STD, viral hepatitis prevention, surveillance, and PRAP clinic services. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Seeing no discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Resolution is recommended. RS 2019-1636, sponsors Virture, Gilmore, and Pulley, approves a grant from the Friends of Metro Animal Care and Control to the Metro Board of Health to provide emergency medical care for the animals. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Seeing no discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Resolution is recommended. RS 2019-1637, sponsors Virture, Gilmore, and Pulley, approves a grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to the Metro Board of Health to enhance access to a comprehensive continuum of high-quality community-based care for low-income individuals and families with HIV disease. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Seeing no discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Resolution is recommended. RS 2019-1638, sponsors Virture, Gilmore, and others, approves a contract between the Metro Board of Health, Nashville Health to coordinate the 2018-2019 Nashville Community Health Survey. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Seeing no discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Resolution is recommended. RS 2019-1641, sponsors Virture, O'Connell, and others, approves a grant from the Recycling Partnership to the Metro Public Works Department to provide support for the planned enhancement of the curbside recycling program. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Seeing no discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Resolution is recommended. RS 2019-1644, sponsor Virture, approves an economic and community development incentive grant to be made to the Industrial Development Board for the benefit of Amazon Incorporated. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. I believe we have some amendments. Councilman Cooper.
Thank you, my chairman. I would move Amendment A.
It's been moved and properly seconded. Councilman Glover, discussion on Amendment A? Councilman Cooper, can you advise the committee, and just for the viewing audience, or do you want Mr. Jamison?
Well, I always defer to our attorney.
Mr. Jamison, can you explain to the committee and just the viewing audience the proposed Amendment A?
Yes, Chair. Amendment A is essentially strikingly similar to the similar amendment offered during the Alliance Bernstein resolution, incentive grant resolution. This, in a nutshell, would submit that the appropriations are dependent upon the solicitation from the Convention Center Authority of an amount equivalent to the amounts on an annual basis to be made through this incentive to Amazon, and that the appropriation be contingent upon a response from the CCA. That response could be no, in which case the resolution is met, but the request and response would be a precondition to the appropriation.
Councilman Cooper.
Thank you. Just renew my motion for Amendment A, and to note that the appropriation for this would not be taking place until June 2020 for the FY21 budget. So well in advance of that event, you would have a response from the MCC, and should it be negative, this is not actually appropriated until June of 2020.
Thank you, Councilman Cooper. Councilman Glover, discussion on Amendment A. Councilman Glover.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So, Mr. Jameson, let me ask the question, if I could. I want to expand it perhaps a bit. In the event they're not able to provide everything that's being, quote, asked for on a voluntary basis, is there anything that would stop the MCC from being able to contribute some portion of this? Or, I mean, I'm just trying to understand if there is money available, because I think we have a pretty narrow venue on how the money could be utilized. So if they are able to help with half of it, a quarter of it, 3/4 of it, does this eliminate that from occurring, or does it keep it wide open?
The resolution does not eliminate. The resolution is purely voluntary. A request is made to the Convention Center Authority, and they say yes or no. In terms of what authority the Convention Center Authority has to disgorge or to make appropriations for these purposes is complicated. There are a minimum of 8 revenue streams, each the subject of separate state legislation that spells out where the money can be appropriated and under what circumstances. There is, we are working with Convention Center authorities to get greater clarification on at least 2 of the revenue streams that I would summarize as follows. Under state law, the Convention Center Authority can make disbursements for those purposes of the Convention Center Authority that meet tourism-related purposes or the other purposes for which the Convention Center Authority exists. Some might construe that to mean to look to the bylaws of the Convention Center Authority to see what their purposes are. And when you look to the Convention Center Authority bylaws, they do reference broader objectives like business development and economic development. Now, is that within the context and within the sphere of tourism related, or is it broadly economic and business development? I don't know. And we're working with their authorities to get greater clarification on those abilities. As of now, I think part of the reason that informs that this resolution makes it a voluntary request rather than a demand is because part and parcel of that uncertainty under state law.
Okay, so just one, I think I already know the answer to the follow-up I'm going to ask you, but this does not jeopardize anything that's already in place for MCC or any of the money that would be collected. It just gives an opportunity that if we're able to open that door for them to contribute towards
Correct.
this. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Glover. Councilman Cooper.
Just renew my message, my motion.
Okay, we're voting on Amendment A. All in favor? Opposed? Amendment will be recommended.
Recommended. And then one final clarification, I think, for the viewers at home, for our counsel, Mr. Jameson. The appropriation, again, just to confirm, under this would not take place until June of 2020.
Correct.
And at that time, this is, in a way, this bill is not binding on the council at that time appropriating the money. If for some reason pay raises aren't met or there is no money for the city, et cetera, this is this resolution is not binding on that appropriation. That will be a separate event.
Right, and the resolution and the agreement themselves both make clear that this is contingent upon the annual appropriation through the budget process by the council office.
It will have to take place that year and every year, and should the MCC decline the opportunity to invest in the city, then the council could take that into account at that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Cooper. Councilwoman Henderson, I believe I have in a packet Amendment B, or you want to offer that amendment? Councilwoman Henderson.
Yes, Chair Vercher, I'd like to offer or move Amendment B, please.
It's been moved and seconded. Do you want to yield to Attorney Jameson to provide the committee the details of your amendment?
Sure, thank you.
The Amendment B offered by Councilor Henderson and Councilman Dave Rosenberg would essentially place a cap of the incentive representing 5,000 jobs, an annual disbursement of $2,500,000 representing that cap of 5,000 jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Jameson. So to be clear, currently the resolution, there is no cap. So in the event if Amazon were to exceed that job number, that would increase the allocation that the city will be required to furnish. This is putting a cap on it. Just clarity for the viewing audience and for committee members, because I know this came into your packet today. So discussion on Amendment B. Councilman Glover.
Thank you, Chair. All right, so Mr. Jameson, let me make sure I understand, because there is not a number, we've been told a number by Amazon at 5,000 is quoted. This would basically say 5,000 is the current cap. However, I'm going to kind of repeat what Councilman Cooper had asked a moment ago. This does not bind future councils if they wanted to expand that. If Amazon came back and said, look, we think we're going to add another 1,000 or whatever the count may be, this limits it for this particular resolution.
Right, but presumably, well, the council would have to act down the road if they wanted to exceed that amount. They would have to act by separate legislation, by resolution.
Okay, all right, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Glover. Councilwoman Allen, discussion on Amendment B.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. Just a general question, is there a precedent for an uncapped grant in the other economic incentives that we've offered, or have they generally had a cap?
So, and let me back up. The cap anticipates, the code provision under 2210 anticipates 500 within the first 5 years, that you've generated that many to qualify for it. So when we did Dell in 99, we did not have a cap on the number of employees. It was a durational cap in the number of years, but there was no cap on how high that number could go. As an aside, my understanding from the development on which Amazon intends to go is if they ever exceeded 5,000 employees, it is not something that development could contain. And so it would not be within that project, so to speak. So they would have to come back to the table, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think, we'd love for them to have more than 5,000, but it seems prudent to me to at least know what we're dealing with here. So I appreciate the sponsors giving us this option to have this discussion.
Thank you, Councilwoman Allen. Seeing no further discussion on Amendment B, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Amendment B will be recommended. Now we're back on the bill, the resolution as amended. Councilwoman Henderson, were you seeking additional recognition? Councilwoman Allen? Thank you, Councilman Glover. You got it, Mr. Jackson?
Yes, ma'am.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Resolution is recommended as amended. Now we're on Resolution RS 2019-1645. Sponsors O'Connell and Weiner. Approves a grant from the Nashville Convention and Visitors Corporation to Metro government to cover safety and security needs, traffic control, emergency management for the 2019 National Football League draft. And I do have a letter to approve. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Councilwoman Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just wondering if someone can address if this amount covers all the expected costs for the events for the items that are listed here.
I got you right here.
Thank you. I'm Terry Clements with the Convention and Visitors Corporation. That amount doesn't come close to what is being spent. The NFL is going to spend a tremendous amount of money, as is the Convention and Visitors Corporation. This was just, we had a blue ribbon committee that raised funds to help put this whole thing together, and we took some of those funds and said, let's give them to the police, OMC, emergency management, and the fire department.
Any further questions, Councilwoman Allen? Seeing no further discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Resolution is recommended. Now we're on bills on second reading. BL 2018-1404, sponsors Roten, O'Connell, Johnson, Mina Johnson, amends the Metro Code to remove certain storage and impound fees for recovered stolen vehicles. We do have some proposed amendments. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. I'm going to go to the sponsor. Hit your button, Vice Chair. Oh, there you go.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the original bill has been amended, which I have not been a part of these amendments. Freddie O'Connell, Councilmember O'Connell to my right, has been a part of this. But I think our learned counsel is going to explain to us what the amendment did. Is that correct?
Sure.
Okay.
Council members, you have two amendments in your packet, and it's my understanding that Amendment B is the one that usurps the other amendment and is the comprehensive amendment. That's at page 8 of your materials. In a nutshell, what that will do is that the original intention of the ordinance is to essentially waive fees for those victims of theft whose vehicles are held at an impound lot, the storage fees. This would impose some obligations upon those theft victims. One, they would be in receipt of notice from the chief of police or his or her designated representative that their vehicle's been stolen and is being held at a particular lot. They would then be allowed to reclaim it as the registered owner, but not simply an authorized operator or lien holder. It has to be the registered owner, and they would have 24 hours within which to do it. They could not waive the fees if they had an insurance policy that covered theft, and they would have to sign an affidavit to that effect. And they also have to have reported their vehicle stolen to the police department in order to receive the waiver benefit. That is an Amendment B.
Thank you, Mr. Jameson. Has Public Works taken a look at this? Are they in agreement with this amendment, or do you know?
I don't know if they've looked at this amendment.
Is anyone here from Public Works? I see Mr. Fields walking his way up.
I think the greatest concern all along was just the issue of the private towers and their specific ones, not the impound lot. So if there's a way to deal with that particular issue, I think from the wrecker standpoint, you know, they're sympathetic and they work with people all the time on it.
Is anybody here from the private towing that could speak on it?
Mr. Murphy, Jim Murphy.
Hey, we got somebody else. We're 2 for 2.
I'm Jim Murphy, and I represent the company that runs the Metro's towing lot. And this amendment basically clarifies the rules that they're going to follow. They already waived the fees for most of these, and so this is just a clarification to make it clear what the process is, what the applicant has to do. It sets a time limit because one of the concerns is if you don't have a time limit, then you fill up the towing lot with vehicles that are not paying the fees. So it's pretty consistent with what's currently the law. It just clarifies those particular issues, the timing and the people who can reclaim the vehicles and what they have to bring in order to get their vehicle back. So yes, we're the vendor is They asked me to help prepare this amendment, so they are supportive of this amendment.
Vice Chair Roden.
Renew a motion for approval.
We're on Amendment A? B. Amendment B? I'm sorry, thank you. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? You want discussion on Amendment B, Councilman Glover? Councilman Glover.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Jameson, I want to go to the section here. It says, fees shall not apply if the storage fees are eligible for coverage under any applicable insurance policy. Is that, I mean, so are we, so if you don't have insurance, it goes away. If you do have insurance, help me understand, because I'm not sure I'm following that piece of it.
What they wanted to avoid was the instance where the vehicle owner has an insurance policy that's going to cover all fees that might be related to the theft of a vehicle.
Okay.
They don't want him double dipping. They don't want him getting the insurance policy and then go and get a waiver of that policy amount from the vendor.
Okay, and so do you feel comfortable, and does Metro Legal feel comfortable that we're within our rights as far as the city, and that we are not, I guess, reaching in, if you have insurance, we're going to treat you differently than if you didn't have insurance?
I feel comfortable.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Glover. Councilman O'Connell, were you seeking recognition? Okay, go ahead and press it again. There you go.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think your Vice Chair and I had similar motivations for bringing this bill to colleagues in the first place, which is I know that I had a constituent who was a victim of vehicle theft who reached out to me, and I was surprised that you know, sort of the difficulty of the recovery process was actually made more difficult by Metro by the imposition of a fee for reclamation of that vehicle. So this bill is really just a you know, sort of an effort at victim relief for those people in Nashville and Davidson County who are residents that have been victims of vehicle theft, so that they are not, in fact, paying Metro for the privilege of having their vehicles returned to them through no fault of their own action. So that's kind of how we got to this point, and I just wanted colleagues to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman O'Connell. So now we're going to take the vote because we're still on Amendment B. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Amendment is recommended. Now we're back on the bill as amended. Thank you, Councilman Glover. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Bill is recommended as amended. BL 2019-50-2024 sponsors Vircher Hall, amends the Metro Code regarding definitions of a qualified company and qualified project and eligibility for economic and community development incentive grants. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Seeing no discussion. Councilman Mendez.
I guess, I don't know whether Mr. Jameson or the sponsor, which is, I guess, you, would like to explain it. And in particular, the thing in the analysis that said that if this were the law already, it wouldn't have interfered with the Amazon job grant. And I guess, I mean, I believe you because the analysis is always right, but that's counter from what my understanding was when I first read it. So if you could walk through what it does and why it wouldn't apply if it had been the law before now.
Mr. Jameson.
I think the sponsor's intent was to limit qualified projects and qualified companies to those that have only taken one dip at the incentive trough, so to speak. So in other words, no, for those companies that have requested or received pilot or TIF or participation agreements, it's a one-shot opportunity for those entities, either by virtue of state or locally publicly funded incentive agreements. Our understanding from the Mayor's Office of Economic Development is that Amazon, the company itself, is not requesting or looking at receiving, sorry, my phone, any property tax abatement or TIF arrangement or participation agreements. And therefore, at least no immediate impact. Of course, if they were to come back later, assuming this were to be adopted, that would be triggered.
So, thank you. So a hypothetical situation. Some project gets a participation agreement, and then and we'll just use Nashville Yards. There was a participation agreement, and if the owners of Nashville Yards wanted to come back for another incentive, then they would just set up Nashville Yards 2 LLC, and then this wouldn't apply?
And that has not yet been anticipated, but once, so to speak, if you set up regulations, then bright minds immediately go up to work into how to subvert it. And so the code 2.210 defines qualified projects and qualified companies. What if somebody were to, in terms of being a qualified company, set up Nashville Yards 2.0 or Dell 2.0? I think this body would probably see through the end run being accomplished by that and be unlikely to adopt it, but in terms of its compliance with the letter of the law, it would be compliant.
Okay, so not for this bill, but for future bills, I don't know whether it's to Metro Legal or you, but somebody ought to talk to a transactional lawyer in town to get a definition of common control or change of control and start working that into these ordinances, because there's like solutions for this that exist out there in the transactional legal world that we don't really take advantage of in the how we draft stuff.
I think since '99, the Dell agreement was preceded by just an ordinance that proposed the wisdom of incentive grants when certain types of companies were contemplating coming here. And that has morphed into a code section. That code section continues to expand every year, not necessarily in complexity, but in terms designed to make sure we're doing this appropriately. Councilman Davis's Do Better bill, for example. I think if we continue to head down this road, fleshing out the potential exploitations of its current terms would be appropriate and wise for this council to do.
And I mean, there's a nuance in our short-term rental law that would have been fixed with something like that, where we get counterintuitive results a couple times. It's more than these transactions. Yeah, all right. Thanks for answering the questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilman Mendez. Councilman Cooper.
Thank you, Chairman. Quick question for our council, following up on Councilman Mendez's. To do the other aspect of it, is what double-dipping instances, if you can think of any, would this bill sort of highlight or bring into question?
Well, I think any entity that has previously been the recipient of either a TIF arrangement and then comes back for a participation agreement or payment in lieu of taxes, any state or local incentive. And
would that include like the parking garage at 5th and Church also having a TIF? Would that be included generally in this other city funds expended? I guess we're getting to this participation agreement kind of area. But you're saying that in all those cases, the double dipping would have been flagged?
Yes, in these instances, assuming passage, yes.
Assuming passage. Great. Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you, Councilman Cooper. Seeing no further discussion, all in favor? Oh, I'm sorry, Councilman Mendez.
Just one follow-up question, and I'm sorry that I don't have the language of the legislation in front of me right now. So does the legislation we're talking about address state incentives at all?
It does.
And I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. Can you tell me how, please?
If it would limit eligibility of companies to those that have not applied for or received any other publicly funded incentive grant, be it a local incentive grant, be it state incentive grant.
So here, I mean, this isn't law right now, but if we did on Amazon, for example, or Alliance Bernstein, where there was a simultaneous state request, would that mean that this would be a no-go?
That's correct. That's correct.
All right, so I'm back to being confused over the analysis. The analysis I thought said that this wouldn't stop the Amazon job grant.
No, that's correct, because I was thinking of only the pilots and the TIF, no other local incentives that were being offered, no participation agreements, et cetera. But it has, my understanding is, has received state-based incentives.
So if this were the law, this would prevent us from doing the Amazon job credit?
Yes.
All right, so, okay, well, that's a difference.
No, that is.
So, I mean, I guess what I request from, I guess the question, Madam Chair, is that the intention that if somebody is simultaneously asking for a state incentive, that they wouldn't be allowed to get a Metro incentive at the same time?
So initially, the intent is what we're doing now is to have a conversation and to take a holistic approach as to how we do incentives. This legislation came as a result from many of you here in this chamber. Every time an incentive deal is brought before us, it creates heartburn for many of us. And in listening to many of you, when you go back to your respective constituents, you can't articulate why a particular industry has received an incentive as opposed to another industry receiving an incentive in your respective districts. What I'm asking is that we go ahead and pass this on second so I can continue the work on this legislation. Maybe the Blue Ribbon Commission may take this up. Do have a commitment from the administration to begin looking at how we look at incentives as a city, but that's my ask.
Okay, so this is a little self-confessional, but so when I first read it on first reading, I was definitely opposed because I felt like just a blanket rule that if you're in the business, if you're getting a state incentive, you don't get a Metro one, then I thought that was not a nuanced rule. And then when I read the analysis, I stopped thinking about it because it said that it wouldn't apply to Amazon. And I guess I'm thinking about it again today. I mean, I really, I hear what you're saying about third reading. I guess this is amendable on third, Mr. Jameson?
It is.
I'm just, I'm not sure about it, how I feel about it. I guess I have to think some more. Because I just, it feels like too blunt an instrument. So I'll stop because I'm not really making any sense. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilman Mendez. Councilman Pulley.
Councilman Mendez got to the main question I wanted to ask about the incentives and how it affects those that are offered by the state. But to expand on that a little bit more, I do want to at least hear from the administration and their position on this. So, Mr. Wilshire, could you comment on the administration's position relative to this bill?
Mr. Wilshire.
Sure. I heard from the chairwoman that she would like to have a broader conversation about incentives and what the goals and objectives are for incentives broadly and what the sort of rules of the road are. And that is, as she referenced, a conversation that she has begun. And I think that the mayor has committed to have a broader conversation about incentives. And so that folks sort of can have an opportunity to sit down and talk about it so it doesn't feel like that these are ad hoc each time. I will say, just to provide a little bit of context of information for this body, in the 7.5 years that I have been in this role, 84 companies have expanded or relocated to Davidson County and received incentives from the state. The city has only incentivized 15 of those. So to provide some broader context about what the level of commitment is by your state government versus your city government, the city has been much more conservative in that. And so a blanket sort of statement that any company that has received and it received incentives. And by the way, it could have been that they received incentives as I read the legislation, and I'll defer to the Council Jameson on this, that they received incentives 10 years before on a different project. It just says that the company has received incentives. I'm not sure about that. Would prohibit the city then from providing incentives for a specific project. Would as I read it, effectively prohibit this body from ever making an incentive offer to anyone, ever.
Okay, thank you. I'm all about advancing this to have a broader conversation. I will say that I would have a difficult time supporting this as written because of some of the things we have heard. I'm not in favor of painting this with such a broad brush that it really backs us into a corner. I'd rather take these things up individually than I have back us into a situation where we can't even get involved in these because of the legislation. But I will support it moving forward, being as I heard we do have the opportunity to amend this on third to, as the chair just articulated, have a broader conversation regarding this, and I appreciate that position. So anyway, thank you so much, and I'll vote for it moving forward so that we can have that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Pulley. Councilwoman Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would ask if we could then re-refer it to this committee on third reading, if we could, just so we could continue that conversation. And then also, as part of the broader conversation, are we bringing in any experts on this? I mean, I know that there are consultants who do very detailed studies on economic benefits of analysis and, of economic incentives and what their spinoffs are. And it seems to me like it would be unwise to make any broad decisions without some rigorous input on what best practices and actual research say, are the results of economic incentives. Is that part of the broader discussion that's happening?
Well, it is. We've had presentations, and again, I say this can be taken up by the Blue Ribbon Commission also. So again, it's about us having a conversation. This legislation is a result of your voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And are you, is your intention for us to bring it back on third reading?
Yeah, we're going to bring it back. We're
in
gonna
2 weeks?
I haven't
Okay.
decided.
It sounds like, we may need some more information between now and then, but I would just move that we re-refer then.
Re-refer back to budget. Thank you, Councilwoman Allen. Councilwoman Gilmore.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. I wanted to just hear quickly if Mr. Wilshire could walk us through how you do the incentives or how you came up on the one with Amazon. If you could.
Mr. Wilshire.
There's a 3-minute version, a 10-minute version, a 20-minute version. I want to be respectful of this body.
And Councilwoman Gilmore, let me preface it with that each incentive deal is differently. So that's for the viewing audience too. So what he's getting ready to articulate, every incentive deal doesn't go through this same methodology.
Yeah.
Except for Amazon.
There are some broad strokes. So I guess the short answer on an overall process is that what typically happens is that companies hire site consultants that advise them on where to expand or relocate to, and they probably look at 100 cities through algorithms, not detailed, rigorous analysis. That through those algorithms, based upon whatever the priorities of that company are, a large manufacturing company for which electric prices are the most important thing may have a different set of cities that they narrow it down to versus an office project that's looking for recent accounting graduates, as an example. But they narrow it down to maybe 15 or so cities, 20 cities, and then their site consultants will typically send out RFPs to those communities, asking detailed information about housing costs, tax rates, labor costs, and those sorts of things. From that process, it's narrowed down to, call it, 6 cities. Each project is different, to 6 cities. And at that stage of the process is typically when the incentive negotiation will begin. They've sort of narrowed it down to that point, and there will be some sort of negotiation. Like most negotiations, I think typically what happens is there's a sort of debate about how important is this to the city. Is it but for, meaning, as I have articulated this body before, but for this incentive, do we think they're coming here anyway? And there are many, many projects that come to Nashville that receive no incentives. I articulated to you that there have been 84 that have expanded and relocated in the state of, in Davidson County, and this is from the state's disclosed Fast Track website. They disclose all the incentives they provide that have expanded in Davidson County in the 7.5 years since I've been here that have, and of those, only 15 have received incentives from the city. So Obviously, in lots of cases, we're not extending offers, but in many cases we do, and in some those are accepted and some those are rejected, but it's a negotiation like every other negotiation, and that negotiation is driven by what's the return to the city on our investment? Is this a project that we really want to have in the city? And are we building an industry that we want to build? So the example that I typically use is we might be more interested in investing in a healthcare technology company because that's a sector we're trying to expand on to grow healthcare technology alongside healthcare services. And this body did this when you incentivized Philips to locate here. We might be less likely to incentivize a semiconductor company because we think it's relatively, no offense to Intel or anyone else out there, but we think it's relatively less likely that the semiconductor industry will all of a sudden decide Nashville's the place that we want to really build and develop this industry. And so when we have tried to focus on particular industries like financial services, like healthcare technology, we've made a bigger push into those sectors through recruitment efforts and incentives. And then it's a negotiation. And it is the administration's job, and has been at least the whole time I've been here, to get as many jobs and as much benefit for as little incentive as possible. And we are negotiating against companies who are looking to maximize the return for their shareholders and their investors. And so it's a negotiation. And so we have not had a matrix that says if you deliver X, you get Y, because we think that we can get and have gotten a better return for the city and not given up incentives in some other cases where we might have otherwise done that. That's a lot of words, but I'm
No,
not sure.
it actually was good. And then I just wanted to see too, I guess, what role, at what point does the council, since we have to vote on it, right? At what point do you pull them in and begin to educate them so that we can better talk to our constituents and the concerns we have? So it's not that you've been working, and not to say that you have, but you know, that you've been working on it for months and then we get it a month before and we're expected, you know, we get calls from realtors and developers saying, you need to do this or you're going to mess it up. But we have other, you know, constituents out there. And how can we, where it's more balanced, right, and informed, and do we have a list of things as a city? I heard you say that, you know, we kind of have, if we're doing healthcare, we do this, but do we have things as a city that says if it meets this mark, if it is healthcare, not that we're merging into health, but if it is healthcare, then you get a point for this. If it goes to the overall wealth and housing, or does it lift up a certain a group of people in the middle? I mean, how do we look at how the policy impacts not only jobs, but people that are of lower class? Because we always say, I shouldn't say lower class, we call them under-resourced or special neighborhoods, but we say that they give money, or I'm just not clear about how that part works. Are we taking that into account, and how so? How are we measuring that?
Yeah, so great question. And I think this process, the process over the last couple of months, has illuminated for me that we have done a very poor job of that, to be quite honest. There have been some things that I have sort of taken for granted, like this distinction between how many times the state participates in incentive versus how many times the locals do, that for me is second nature. But you guys aren't doing economic development all the time. And so I think there's a very important and overdue conversation on the philosophy of incentives that we need to have, and that's what the chair has asked for. So broadly speaking, this body has taken certain actions. You have taken certain actions to inform priorities through requirements. And so specifically, this body has required that any company receiving a pilot has set a goal of 20% DBE participation on that project. This body has also taken the action that any company coming to receive an incentive is required to speak to WeGo about the easy ride. In those two specific examples, it was this body saying, these are things that are important to us. And it is a tricky thing because you guys are sort of put on the spot after months of negotiation, and the deal has sort of been put to that point. And I think that's one of the unfortunate things. Obviously, things leak out. my potential next job being among them, the more folks know about things. And so having a negotiation with a company that's considering relocating amongst a variety of different cities is a difficult thing to do with a large number of council members. And so you are put in a position of having to sort of come to it at the end. The most clear way that this body has had is to say, look, it's either up or down. You're for it, against it, but also to provide guidance on future deals about what you want to see in future deals. And we've incorporated those in a number of ways in future deals. And so I think having a broader conversation now to say, look, this is what we're looking for, and this is the benchmark it's going to be judged against. It's time to reset. The Do Better bill, another example of that. Here's the expectation that we have. Here's what we want to see from companies beforehand. Each of those things has been incorporated into subsequent proposals that have been brought to this body.
Okay, and then how can we bring it into one, I guess, overall matrix or rubric that we use, and what is a cutoff point that we have as a city, or do we have a cutoff point?
I mean, here,
as it relates to incentives, or do we just keep on saying, hey, looks good, that's what we want to do?
Here I am now totally freelancing and not, I believe that this city is not well served by having a matrix. I believe that with a matrix, this body would be establishing a set of rules that would perhaps provide incentives to companies that otherwise we would be able to attract to this city without incentives. So I'm personally opposed to a matrix. I do think that this body has, obviously, as the councilman discussed on the earlier resolution about Amazon, each year as a part of the budget, there is a decision to fund or not fund that deal. And then each time a proposal is brought to this body about a new one, you have a responsibility, an opportunity to say, no, look, I just don't want this one. I don't think this is not one worth incentivizing. So those are the two opportunities, two specific votes to have, but I think there is a broader conversation that's ongoing right now about the will. And I can tell you, so we've had two big ones recently, Alliance Bernstein and Amazon, but as you know, those are the first two that have been brought up in the last 14 months. We hadn't done one since December of 2017. And those two that we brought up were for 1,000 jobs and for 5,000 jobs, which would lead you to believe that this city is being much less aggressive about incentives right now. We are still open for business, I want to say that publicly, but the city has been, to your point, when things are as they are, we're not incentivizing a lot of things that a lot of other cities are incentivizing right now. We're just not. And that's because of what you guys have built. The city we built, we don't think that we have to do that as much. But we do think in certain circumstances that are very significant and have a potential to make a big impact on the city, it is prudent for this body, as you have, to invest in partnership with companies.
Yeah, and I guess too, just how do we evaluate it? Because with the DBE and especially with Amazon, because they're leasees, it got a little tricky, right, as it relates to the construction. So just how do we measure and evaluate? Because we set these goals, but the accountability is not always directly there. And at the end of the day, because we have to vote on it, our constituents, all constituents, right, whoever they may be, still want a certain thing that they expect. And even though we can't answer all the questions, right, some things we should still be able to transparently say, if we are committed to this, do it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think we should continue to get better. I would say the deals that we're doing today are way better than the deals that we did 7 years ago. And I'll take responsibility, culpability for the ones that weren't done well beforehand. I've learned a lot. I think this body can continue to learn a lot and to get better along the way and to do and hold companies accountable. So yes, ma'am.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it's not about good or bad, right? Because the city's doing really well. So I don't want you to feel like you're doing bad, but it's just how do we evaluate it so that more citizens can participate, more residents can participate. Because if we look at the climate we're doing, it's very, very good for some, but some others are not doing as well. And I just want to see how we're measuring it. Because if we only measure it by jobs, then, you can do it like that. But I don't know that that's getting the results that we want for all the residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Gilmore. Vice Chair Rowland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question was answered earlier. Thank you. Apologize.
That's not a problem. Councilman Cooper, at large.
Thank you, and Mr. Wilshire, thank you. In advance of the next discussion, I guess, whenever this comes back into the council, just if you would examine the but-for standard case history and speak to how was that but-for proved to you with Amazon and Alliance Bernstein. So if you, again, I think that's going to be the important question. If you're invoking a but-for standard, then you have to go ahead and set up the evidencing of that in advance. And what is that? And you know, feel free to go ahead and say, this is how I knew Amazon but for this, or otherwise I think we have to drop but for as one of our standards. Okay, so next time? Okay.
I'm sorry, I thought you said next.
Well,
next
I
time
mean,
you
that's
want me to
fine if you
address
want
that.
to think about it and have a, you know, as always, you have a thoughtful answer in this. If you want to wait until next time, or if you know right now how
Sure.
it was that you knew that it was but for. In Amazon's case, what proof do they or any other company need to have to qualify under but for?
Sure. I do want to make sure I give a more complete answer. I mean, I can talk about the specific examples in each of those, but let me be a little bit more thoughtful in the response.
Well, if you would, because you've got another problem here, which is being fair to everybody else.
Yeah.
There are a lot of other job creators too. Why do these people get this and others don't? And they're creating good jobs too. Yeah. And as a city, you've got to be fair about who you're handing any incentive out. And so that's the underside of this, is why are you not giving it to other people? Did they just simply not apply? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Cooper. Councilwoman Hurt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not a member of Budget and Finance, so I'm very happy that you've been so gracious to give me the floor. But I'm not going to be long. I just want to reiterate what Councilwoman Gilmore has said. She is dead on it, right on top of it, hitting the nail on the head. And this doesn't seem like it's a Nashville problem. We just left the National League of Cities, and it's county, it's a country, nationwide problem. And I think that Nashville misses the opportunity to be a leader when it comes to things like this, because we are the it city and people want to come here. They want to be here. I think it's up to us to set the tone. And I think it has to come from the leadership, because by the time it gets to us, it seems as though the deals are already done. So I just implore you all to make sure that it is inclusive when you are setting the outline of what it's going to take for them to do business in Nashville. And when you do that, you make it much easier for us to be able to stamp what you are saying and doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Hurt. Seeing no further discussion, the motion to approve and re-refer back to budget. All in favor? Opposed? That show of hands. All in favor?
2, 3, 4, 5.
Opposed? Bill is recommended. With referral back to Budget and Finance. BL 2019-1525 sponsors Vercher and Hall, amends the Metro Code pertaining to the definition of competitive bidding in accordance with the Tennessee Code annotated. Is there a motion? It's been moved and properly seconded. Seeing no discussion, all in favor? Opposed? Bill is recommended. Before we adjourn, want to remind committee members that we are in budget season. The mayor's budget hearings begin next week. You should have a letter already as it relates to the preliminary questions to the Metro department heads, the process that we're going to be utilizing this year in the budget process. Also, we're going to be adding a hearing for the nonprofits. So if you want to add any questions that you would like to be submitted in advance to those nonprofits, you can go ahead and do that as well. Want to remind you too, please utilize the SharePoint. That ensures that all of us are on the same page. I can see what Councilwoman Henderson is asking, so it alleviates the redundancy as it relates to us asking the same questions to department heads. Did I miss anything, Mr. Jameson? With that, we are adjourned.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.